As a culture, we're incredibly interested in the private lives of celebrities, politicians, and other public figures. Is it just an unhealthy obsession? Would it be better if we simply ignored what goes on behind closed doors as these people's private business? Or are we sometimes justified in reaching into the dark and flicking on the light?
This is Signs of the Times Radio with Kent Kingston.
Hi, I'm here with Mark Hadley. He's a journalist and film critic based here in Sydney. How are you, Mark?
Great, thanks, Ken, and thanks for having me on the show again.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. Look, you're a regular writer in Signs of the Times magazine, and hopefully now a regular guest on the radio show and podcast. It's certainly good to have you here.
That'll be great.
Now, Mark, you wrote an article in this month's edition of Signs of the Times at the August edition. It's actually the cover story. Well done. You made it again.
Thank you. Your choice, not mine. But still.
Oh, well, look, I chose it because it's a really good article, really thought-provoking, deals with a lot of current issues in popular culture and in political life as well. So it touches on a lot of things that people are interested in. And so I thought, it does deserve, plum position. Now, this article is titled Public Fame, Private Shame and the Non-Existent Divide. Now, you start off in this article, one of the first things that you discuss is a movie that's come out just this month in August called The Wife. Can you give us a bit of a synopsis there of what that movie's about?
Sure. The Wife is actually based on a best-selling book by Meg Wolitzer by the same title that tells the story of a couple whose public and private lives are actually worlds apart. So he, the husband in this particular situation, is a very famous author, and they're on their way to Helsinki in a plane. The drama takes place, high above the earth in a plane, and he's going to get a Nobel Prize for literature, and she has been the supportive wife the whole way along. In public, that's the picture. In private, he's crushed her life in order to lift up his own dreams, his own goals, and likewise, she has allowed herself to be sort of stepped upon in order to achieve this great moment that they're both going to experience now. And even then, though it's a Nobel Prize, she couldn't think much higher than that for an award, she realised that she's gained nothing from the entire thing. She, by the way, Joan Castlemont, is played by Glenn Close. And it's a great performance, but the tricky thing that really comes out of it is just a wonderful picture of how what's going on in a marriage could bear absolutely no resemblance whatsoever to what's going on publicly, in life for that couple.
It's really interesting the way that the media is really interested in the marital ups and downs of Donald and Melania Trump. Are they holding hands? Aren't they holding hands? Does she look happy or unhappy? It seems that people.
Is she telling to get the children out of the detention or not?
Yeah.
How to say, and it's true, and that's part of the tension. I mean, the media likes to look into that, but at the same time, the tension sits on the fact that we seem to accept as a excuse, or if you like, as a defence, that it's absolutely all right for a politician to step back and say, hang on a second, you've got no right to look into my private life. And why is that? Well, the common defence is what is going on in my private life has nothing to do with my public life. And I guess the article, what I do is I question that. Is that really possible for someone to actually have such a hard wall between private and public?
Although I guess you'd have to say, Mark, wouldn't you, that there are so many people out there in the public eye who are hounded and harassed, by the paparazzi, by journalists, by tabloid newspapers and magazines. And they just wear them down. I mean, obviously, Princess Diana, the Princess of Wales, is the ultimate example of someone who died, trying to escape the paparazzi, apparently. Surely there should be an idea of the right to privacy and the right not to have people poking cameras over the fences of of your backyard to catch you sunbaking or whatever.
Agreed. And I think you've hit on the right use of the word when you say example. The example is what is the important thing here, because if a person is placing themselves in the public arena, as many of these people do, to be an example to us, and yet at the same time then to say, look, this part of my life is an example, but not that part of my life, well, then I think that can be questioned. I have a great deal of feeling for actors who go on to portray characters for us, but then somehow we consider them public property. And so, they're suddenly allowed to have their privacy invaded. Now, and there's a classic case where they haven't put themselves up as an example. They're just doing a job that has to do with being in the public eye. And there are plenty of people in the public eye. Let's take, for example, you don't have to go far. You could say your local principal, of your local school.
Yeah.
That person has a higher standing. They're in the public eye, so to speak, but they're not putting themselves in the public eye for the sake of being an example. Now, when we talk about politicians, though, because they're, or for that matter, other sort of figures who actually place themselves as models for the rest of us, that's a different question. Politicians, their entire basis for being elected is that we can trust them morally to represent us. And now that's a different question whatsoever. To say one part of my life bears moral examination, but you have no right to look at the other moral factors of my life, to me is a bit of an ask.
So
okay?
how are you using the word moral here, Mark Hadley? Because quite often people use the word moral merely to talk about relationship related or sexually related behaviour. What do you mean by morally?
No, I think that's a really good question, okay, because I feel like I don't want us to talk about morality as if somehow it was just do you drink too much or has it got to do with your sexuality or the way you express yourself in public and things like that. No, I think that when I use the word moral, and particularly this article, people can judge me and read it and have a look, I'm trying to talk about the guiding focus of our life. Okay, so for example, it's easy to talk about it for a Christian or for that matter anybody who's part of an organised religion because their guiding focus of their life is often written down, and so you can measure it against it. For a Christian, it's the life of Christ. That's what we measure our morality, our guiding focus against.
Yeah.
I expect Buddhists would measure themselves against Siddhartha. I expect that Muslims would measure themselves against Muhammad. And so that's easy. But in some respects, too, we have, say, politicians who will give themselves a public morality based on the values they stand for. So they say, I'm not going to make any enemies or any friends here, but I'll just pick examples out. Say, for example, the Labor Party says we are all for social action.
Yeah.
We're for giving the little person a go. We're for creating a safety net. That's a concern for people who are lesser positioned than ourselves, and we want to take care of them.
Yeah.
Now, if that's your morality, that's what's your guiding light and your structure for your life. If you're found to be an abusive person for your staff, you would question that because there you are in a power play situation, not demonstrating consistency between your morality, which you preach, if you like. I mean, everybody does when they say this is what I believe, and how you practice it. And there's nothing like going back to one of my mother's, tried and tested sayings, as I'm sure many of your listeners might know. You've got to practice what you preach.
Yeah,
there is no distinction between your public declaration and how you live.
Okay, so you I think were hinting at one of our past prime ministers, Kevin Rudd, there, who was famously.
I might have been, but I'm, like I said, I'm not trying to sway because we could pick up a liberal example. It would be terribly hard. We could democratic examples and for the Greens and the rest. So there's no particular political persuasion.
Yeah, but
just the fact that there's got to be consistency.
Yeah, but I totally see what you're saying. I mean, if here you have a party, the Labor Party, which is supposed to be based on the idea that workers and employees should have a fair go, and then you have a Labor Party leader who then treats his own employees or workers in a terrible way. It's incredible hypocrisy, isn't it?
And that's when the private-public argument breaks down. And I guess the center of my argument, if you like, in the article, is that I'm actually not convinced there is a divide. I'm not really sure in the end that there really is, for anyone, a major distinction between the public and the private. And the reason why I feel that is because, well, not simply me, but other philosophers, and in fact Jesus himself has pointed to the fact that they're all proceeding from the same heart. You know, and so as Jesus so famously put it, you don't go picking grapes from thorn bushes. You don't go picking figs, you know, from other trees that are just not fig trees.
Yeah.
If the core is not right, then it won't express itself publicly or privately in the same way.
Wow. Okay. And you said it's not just one side of politics. I mean, in your article, you spent quite a while talking about the situation of our former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, who's a national politician and a part of the governing coalition, of course. Can you take us through some of the ups and downs there? And I mean, I think even since you wrote the article, there have been more ups and downs.
Oh, definitely. It's got murkier and murkier. But if we just go back to the seed of the situation, then we can see that public-private playing out again. So Barnaby Joyce's relationship with his former staffer becomes public knowledge, particularly because she has become pregnant and he's going to become a father. And on that basis, we see him shamed into a position where finally he has to resign the leadership. Now, the big argument that exploded across the media was, is this an infringement of his private life? And quite surely so. He wanted to defend that, and in fact he wanted to say, look, this is what's going on over here is my private life, and what happens in the public arena, the two are never quite affected. But what linked the two is the practice of deception. So when it became clear how deceived his wife had been in the situation, I think it was relevant for people to ask, if a man can practice deceit in his private life, what would stop him practicing that deceit in his public life? And if you remember what actually started to occur, is people started digging into the details of how his former staff had been treated after their relationship had been formed, and she'd been appointed to various lucrative positions, which might have been justified, but it was fair in saying at that point, did this deceit flow out? Did she receive things by virtue of relationship and not because of who she was professionally?
Where I think Barnaby also sort of shot himself in the foot is by saying, okay, look, I can cop this sweet. I am a public figure. I'll be happy to take this criticism, but leave Vicky Campion, his new partner, out of this. And that seemed quite reasonable, up until the point that they decided to appear on commercial TV and have a sort of a tell-all interview. I mean, at that point, weren't they then themselves inviting even more scrutiny and into their private lives?
I think so. And I think, look, I want to be really careful about how I'm talking about Barnaby, because I don't want anyone to feel like I'm saying, oh, well, here we are, it's shock jock radio time, and we're just criticising people who are easy targets. You're right. What Barnaby has done is he's crossed his own line back again, if you like, and he's made it a public issue. And in fact, it was even more murky the moment he started accepting money for the story itself. I guess the man, I have all the sympathy in the world for Barnaby, because I think at that point he was caught in his own story, caught up in his own web. And that's really what happens to all of us. We sit back and I could sit in my study and write my pontificating articles about no divide between public and private, but someone might very well look at my life and say, are you consistent, Mark? Is there a consistency between how you live and the sort of things you say? And I would hope I'm striving for that consistency. But the tricky thing is that we're all in that position, because it's not as if just politicians live lives with degree of public exposure. I'm a father, so I'm the public head of my family. I'm helpful at my school, and there are things that I do in work that put me in a public position. Am I open to scrutiny? And I would say that I would be the first to confess that if somebody took a magnifying glass to my life, I would not like everything exposed there either. But I wouldn't say my defence is you've got no right to look. I think my only defence would have to be, you're right, it's part of the human condition.
Yeah.
That we are inconsistent people. We have a problem about being consistent, and it happens to be heart deep.
Yeah. So I guess when we look at other people who are, caught in the public spotlight and have done, something untoward, I guess our attitude really should be, but for the grace of God, go I. It's none of us is perfect. I think the Bible says, none of us is perfect. No, not one.
No, one. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And look, if you don't mind me saying so again, I brought my mother into this once before. I'll trade out her wisdom once again.
Yep.
Mums have always got those great phrases, and one of them that stuck in my mind was every time I was pointing a finger, I was pointing 3 back at myself. It's a good thing to learn, because the whole point of the Bible is not to clean up public morality. It's not as if somehow we could drag it off the shelf and start beating politicians around the ears and saying you shouldn't do this, or film stars and you shouldn't do this, or whoever else. What it's actually saying is humanity is going to have this public-private problem. Whether it be in the public sphere or the private sphere, we're going to keep falling over because we actually have a problem with the heart. And so Jesus said, look, the heart is from which all things flow, and if that spring is foul, what comes out of it is going to be foul. And then he lists off all the sorts of problems human beings could have. And so if I was going to say anything to anybody who is looking at the Signs of the Times this month round, I'd say take this as a great opportunity to sharpen yourself and say, am I trying to just preserve the illusion that I'm doing okay, that I'm somehow, compared to Barnaby Joyce or compared to Trump or compared to someone else, I seem to be doing okay. They're easy comparisons to make.
Yeah.
But, if you compare yourself to Jesus, then that's a different conversation altogether.
Oh, yeah, wow. Now, something that Jesus said has sort of really struck me, and I've wondered at the practical implications of it. He said something along the lines of, the things that happen in the dark will be shouted from the rooftops. And that to me seems to be, in some ways, a good thing, because there are so many places in the world and situations in the world where really terrible things are done to people, often in the name of greed or profit or oppression or war or whatever. And it seems to me that what Jesus is saying there, that, hey, look, there is going to come a time when these sorts of situations are going to be opened up to scrutiny and to judgment, and justice will finally be done. I kind of get the sense that with this whole Harvey Weinstein, hashtag Me Too movement stuff, that we see some of this stuff happening right now. We get maybe a little foretaste of what it means to, open up this hidden secret that's been causing so much pain, and to, finally have an awareness and finally have some justice done. Do you see where I'm coming from there?
Definitely. And I think one of the challenging/encouraging things about that verse is one that points 2 ways too. Because on the one hand, for those who are struggling with a sense of justice, who are wondering when God is going to do something about something, they take comfort in Jesus' promise. Don't worry. Anything that is in the darkness, it's going to be dragged out into the light. It's going to happen. And that's something that I think sometimes in our lives we're all going to have to lean back on and go, this is well and truly beyond me, and no one seems to be able to see the truth of what's happened to us or what's happened to my family or what's happened to me. And yet God promises that will occur. But then the verse points back the other way, and it says, if you think that you can actually hide these parts of your life behind a distinction like, that's my private life, thank you very much, you've got no right there, you're fooling yourself. That God is actually immensely just. In fact, actually, when the Old Testament wants to talk about how just God is, it says it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. God is perfect God, and that's the standard we compare ourselves against. So for me, the public-private divide is an unhelpful one.
Yeah, sure.
And I would say that when we start talking as human beings about that's my private life and that's my public life, what we're really doing is we're putting up shields, as if to say, God, you can come this far and no further. Or, I invite judgment this far but no further. And those shields always advantage ourselves. But if they're not existent, then we're kidding ourselves. If they're made of paper, they'll all be blown away on the last day.
Yeah, this is sort of a tangential question, but I think it is related particularly to your situation, as a film media, as someone who's in the public kind of realm and looking at this sort of stuff. When you see someone like Harvey Weinstein, I mentioned before, or who has been publicly outed for a lot of misdeeds and misbehaviour, Woody Allen comes to mind, or even Mel Gibson, with his anti-Semitic rants and this sort of stuff. Do you then have trouble appreciating their artworks? Are you able to mentally separate their artworks from the people that they are, or is this another situation where that divide is non-existent?
That's a really good point. That's a fascinating question. I should write an article about that. I think that personally, I don't have a problem with their artwork because I see us as fractured people.
Yep.
And so in my life, if you think of all of humanity as a mirror of the image of God, if God created humanity, in Genesis it says it created him in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So every man and every woman is reflecting the image of God. The problem in a broken world is it's a broken mirror. So there are some parts of me that still reflect the image of God on my best days, and there are other parts that, they reflect someone else entirely, I suspect. And that's the problem. So some days I can look at something I have written and I can think to myself, that's a good article, and I hope it points in the right direction. Or that script I worked on today, I'm really happy with how that turned out, and I hope it helps people think a bit differently. And then I can go upstairs and behave abominably to my wife and apologise 10 minutes later and think, where did that come from? And that's because I'm a fractured human being. I know this sounds strange to say this, but I feel nothing but sympathy for people like Mel Gibson and Barnaby Joyce and others, simply because they've been caught up in a situation where their worst sides have been exposed. And I would hate that to happen to me. I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm saying there are bad parts of me, and I'd hate them to be blown out of proportion. But I wouldn't want to pretend that no one had any right to believe anything other than good about me. There are bad things in our lives, and we should be honest about it. And so I can appreciate their films, I can appreciate their books, because I see in them sometimes the best bits of God's character being reflected outwards. But the worst bits, they don't just cease to exist just because someone happens to be a good filmmaker or a good writer.
Yeah, and I guess then you can take it home, to your own family and friends. I mean, you may have a friend who has, cheated on their partner and abandoned their children or whatever. Really messy, sort of yucky situations that have left a lot of people hurt. How do you deal with that friend from that point on? Do you remain their friend or do you cut them off socially? I mean, those can be really, hard situations. Do you take sides when friends of yours are divorcing?
Look, I'll be honest, we've been in that situation as a family, and the only thing I can say is everybody, in those difficult situations, you don't want to say to a person, you have no right to be angry, or you have no right to be sad, or you have no right to be traumatized, by what has happened. But there is a greater grace which God urges us to reach for, and that is His grace, His forgiveness in a situation. It sounds outrageous to say it, but in the midst of family breakdowns like that, when the private mess comes right out into the open, into the public, and we're all suddenly aware of what's been going on, the answer is to seek restoration, not to seek blame. It is simplistic, but it is an axiom. It's a truth that we really need to hold on to, because we all need redemption. And a friend of mine actually said to me, I've got a friend, I'm sure you have plenty, and others who have this sort of close relationship where you can actually stand alongside someone. You walk alongside them and you do the best you can to support each other. And sometimes I say to my friend, gosh, you've been a great support to me this week. I feel like I've just been falling all over my feet. And he says back to me, don't worry, next week it's me. And that's sort of thing I think we have to keep in mind in the face of the worst case of trouble and strife within family and then in public situations too. But for the grace of God, there go I. Next week it might be me. How would I behave accordingly.
Yeah. You talked about, God extending this incredible grace and this incredible forgiveness and the offer of redemption to us. And I guess if we count ourselves as someone who is trying to, walk in the way of Jesus, someone who is trying to reflect more accurately that image of God that is within us, then I guess the call on us is to walk alongside people who are broken and struggling, even people who have made mistakes that we might, disagree very deeply with. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't still, not be there to support them, to be with them, to, walk with them through that tough time.
Absolutely. Got time for one more of my mother's great sayings. It has to be that, people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. The Bible points out that we're faulted people, that we all need redemption, and that by virtue of that, having found it, we're able to offer it to other people. Sitting in judgment is not a very Christ-like approach to people's problems. As I remember, Jesus spent more time down on his knees and with other people trying to bring them up. It was only those people who actually stood back, the Pharisees, so to speak, who were casting judgment, that he actually had his most critical words for.
Yeah.
I think I would rather be making mistakes in offering maybe too much mercy than it would be in passing too much judgment.
Yeah, and I understand that Jesus actually used a particular Greek word in a new way that it hadn't been used before. The word was hypocrite, or that's the English version of it, which means under a mask. So he said, you religious leaders, you're like actors with a mask on. You're two-faced, basically, is what he was saying. On the outside, you're all wonderful and holy and pious, but inside, he said, you're like a grave that's whitewashed on the outside, nice and shiny and pretty. On the inside, it's full of dead men's bones. So yeah, he didn't hold back when he had some criticisms to make.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, if you like, that's Jesus confronting the public-private divide all over again.
Yeah.
One of the things I've noticed as I've got older, that when I was younger, I hung around with lots of different groups. And you might, some of your listeners might remember this. You're kind of one way with one group, and then with maybe with a rowdier group of people, you're another way.
Yeah.
And then with different people, you can tend to behave differently, almost to the point of being a different person, in different circumstances. And as I've got older, I've realized that what you really want to do, under God and with his strength, is to unite yourself, to be as you are in one group to another group as well. You want to be the same person all the way through. Jesus is saying, drop the mask. The hypocrisy of hiding behind the mask, I'm like this, I'm like that, when you're not really. Admit who you are. Be who you are and bring that to God and let him change the bits that need changing. I suspect we've had it up to here, up to the eyeballs in Australian, and for that matter, in international politics, with politicians who are holding masks up and saying, this is what I believe. It would be much better. I think the biggest fall for grace for Barnaby Joyce was not that he'd proven to be faulted, was that everybody believed him to be a fresh wind through politics, an authentic person who was there for the battler and so forth. So the distance between the way he had behaved privately and the way he was speaking publicly was what caught us all off guard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly sobering thoughts there, and I guess it really, what we're saying today is that really should cause us to reflect on ourselves rather than point the fingers at others. Thanks so much, Mark Hadley, for being with us this week on Signs of the Times Radio.
Ken, it's always fun. Thanks very much.
Today's episode was based on an article appearing in this month's Signs of the Times magazine. A subscription is just $26 for 11 issues a year. To find out more, visit signsofthetimes.org.au. Signs of the Times has been published in Australia since 1886 and is proudly produced by Adventist Media.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.